What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting show in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet. We're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time. I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. If you're listening to us currently on iTunes, Spotify, or any other podcast network, please make sure you say hello in the review section. Leave us a detailed one and a 5-star rating. What's up, everybody? Welcome in. This is episode 201 of our weekly podcast, The Sit Down, and I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. One of the most interesting and turbulent times over the last 30 to 40 years in the mafia was the reign of people like Anthony Gaspipe Casso. It was a very violent time in places like Brooklyn and other areas of New York, and the Lucchese family was forever changed by people like Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso. One of the individuals that was very prominent during that time was the man behind Casso in this photo, a person called Anthony Baratta. Who exactly was Anthony Baratta? And is he still involved with the mafia today in his 80s? The story of Bowat Baratta next on the sit down. Anthony Baratta was born on July 8th, 1938 in Manhattan, New York City. He was the second child of Anthony Baratta Sr. and his wife, Phyllis. Now, according to what we know, they would have just two children, a son and a daughter, Amelia being the daughter and Anthony Jr. being the son. Now, by 1950, the Barattas would live at 157 East 123rd Street in East Harlem. Now, as far as what we know about Mr. Baratta's father, Anthony Sr., there is a lot of reason to believe that he may have had some sort of connection to multiple families, including the Gambino crime family. In some digging that I do on Anthony Baratta, I want to make this clear first of all. There's a lot of inaccurate reporting that Anthony Baratta's father was named Peter Baratta. That is untrue. Again, these are the census records. There's directly from historical reference that Anthony Baratta's father was named Anthony. Now, there is some connection to Peter Baratta, according to what we know. Peter Baratta was a Gambino member. Okay, he was from Harlem. He had a brother, Anthony Baratta. Now, Peter Baratta also had another brother, Michael, and they were both said to be members of the Gambino family. Notice in criminal associates with Peter Baratta, his brother Anthony is listed as a criminal associate. Now, according to this census record, Anthony Baratta's father was a truck driver. Now, again, that may have just been a legitimate job he had, and maybe it was involved in some sort of underworld activities. That said, Anthony Baratta had connections to the American Mafia through his uncles, who were said to be, again, members of the Gambino crime family. Now, again, remember, when you lived in Harlem in those days, you had connections to the Genovese, the Lucchese, the Gambinos. Also notice that one of his criminal associates is a person called Alfonso Mosca. Now, Mosca is a longtime name connected to the Gambino crime family. Anyway, Anthony Baratta would eventually get into the criminal world and become involved in the streets, likely late in the 50s. Remember, he was born in 1938. Early 60s was probably his most likely foray into the mob. We always talk about on this channel, on this podcast, most of the people that we discuss, their lives are already decided, and the places they grew up in are infested with mobsters. And there is no more place infested with the mafia from the 30s until the 90s than East Harlem. And East Harlem had all sorts of families. And it really was the birthplace of American kingpins who were wholesalers of narcotics. Today in America, the wholesalers of narcotics are cartels in Mexico. They essentially oversee a lot of the wholesale of narcotics. So if a street gang in Chicago is selling, dope, that's coming from cartels. Back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the wholesalers of narcotics in New York City, so the Connect were mobsters. People like Big John Ormento, people like Joe Beck D. Palermo, people like Carmine, Willie the Wop, Lacasio. Carmine Willie the Wop Lucchese was one of the biggest drug traffickers in East Harlem at the time. And it was said that this was the first rabbi, if you will, that Mr. Baratta had. If you look into Baratta's history in the 60s and into the 70s, he's an associate, listed associate of Willie the Wop Lucchese. Now, I want to discuss a little bit about Willie the Wop and how truly transcendent he was as a trafficker. He was making tens of millions of dollars in the 60s into the 70s as a wholesaler. He had a direct connection to Sicily, to Palermo. And remember, when it comes to narcotics, Carmine Galante gets a lot of love, and he was one of the titans of that world back then. But the biggest traffickers of narcotics in New York City were in Manhattan, and they were all connected to the Lucchese family. Joe Beck, John Ormento, Carmine Tramonti, the Pleasant Avenue group. All those guys were connected to these people we're talking about. And another one that was in Manhattan was Willie the Wop Lucchese, who had been around really since the 30s and 40s. Now, some early associates of Mr. Lucchese's crew included Anthony Baratta, Antonio Curly Russo, Anthony from 28th Street, DeMeglio, and Jimmy Cerullo. All of these individuals would eventually become made members of the Mafia and were placed into the crew of Lucchese. Now, the first person to get made when the books opened in 1976, one of the first people to get made was Curly Russo. And down the road in 1978, Curly Russo, who was a friend to Anthony Baratta, was kind of an overseer. He would be his sponsor when Baratta was inducted into the American Mafia and the Lucchese Crime Family in 1978. Now, when we look at that ceremony, there were some big people that were inducted alongside Baratta in that ceremony. They would include Martin Ticetta, who is still alive today and is serving a long sentence in prison in New Jersey, Michael Perna, as well as Paolo LaDuca, who at one point was considered a liaison with the Lucchese Crime Family to members in Sicily. He was an old school Sicilian guy. So things are working out for Anthony Baratta by the late 70s. He was, around 40 years old. He was making a ton of money selling narcotics. He had legit interest in restaurants. He was moving out into doing extortion. He was kind of making a foray into topless bars. He was, getting involved with all sorts of rackets, and he was a big time earner, and he learned from the best. Some of his people, like his captain, Carmine Lucchese, had been around for decades, man. They were trusted people in the Lucchese Crime Family, and they made tens of millions of dollars in that racket. Now, by 1983, Anthony Baratta would get a good and bad call. The bad call was that his captain, Carmine Lucchese, had suffered a heart attack and died in 1983. That said, it was likely around that time Baratta received the call that he would be bumped up and he would become a captain or capo di Cina in the Lucchese Crime Family, taking over the old Harlem crew. Now, remember, in 1983, the boss of the Lucchese Crime Family at the time was Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo. Now, I've talked extensively about Tony Ducks Corallo, but as we know, he would be involved in a commission trial in 1985 and be sent to prison for the rest of his natural life, a year or two after that. And that would usher in a very violent and uncertain time in a family that was indeed very powerful. The issue that, to me, the Lucchese Crime Family always had after Tony Ducks, and remember, they had some powerful leaders over the years, whether it was Tommy Lucchese, whether it was Tony Ducks, even Tramonti for a period of time, very big powerhouse in Harlem. The problem after Corallo was that they never had high-end leadership after that. They had a very difficult time in choosing the right people. And the choosing of Vica Musso and Anthony Casso was a very bad decision, because we would find by the late 80s and into the 90s, it became a total mess, which we will indeed talk about. Now, I do mention that Anthony Baratta was, not an overseer completely, but he was very much a person of interest as a narco trafficker. He was making a lot of money, that Pleasant Avenue area in the 70s and 80s. It was also said that at one point, people that connected to Baratta were even suppliers to people like Nicky Barnes. Now, remember, Nicky Barnes gets all the credit for being this big drug kingpin in Black Harlem and other areas, but the man they call Mr. Untouchable was getting his drugs from, guess who? Italians, the mafia. They were the drug cartels before drug cartels. That's the truth. I mean, these groups were no different at the time. Like the Lucchese Crime Family at the time was no different than the Sinaloa cartel. And obviously, it's a much larger percentage of narcotics. But in New York at the time, there was no Mexican cartels. There were no, a lot of the direct lines of narcotics and dope came from Italians, as I said. Now, I did mention that at one point, Mr. Baratta was getting involved with topless bars as well. He would send one of his people, a person called Joseph Joey Bang Bang Massaro, to handle things on Long Island. And this, though, would become very prolific. The Lucchese's and Bonanno crime families would fight over this, and it would even get Joey Bang Bang a long time in prison due to charges on extortion and things like that. In the topless bar world, which was a big thing out on Long Island in those years. Here we can see Anthony Baratta with two of his crew members, Vincent Jimmy Cerullo on the right, and in the middle, Anthony DiMagali, who I referenced a little bit earlier, Anthony DiMeglio. This is at really the height for Mr. Baratta. Eventually, though, we would find that Baratta was involved in a kind of bizarre situation as he sat down for a meeting. We do know that in the late 80s into the early 90s, Baratta gets a bit of a bump. Eventually, Anthony Casso, Vic Amuso go on the run, and there's a committee that is created to run the Lucchese crime family. One of the people on the committee would be Anthony Baratta. Now, what that exactly means is when a committee is created, they basically run the family. We've talked about that. The Gambinos did that, and people like the Lucchese's did it. And we do know that though it was a committee, there was a pattern of acting people in the positions. Baratta was the acting underboss, and the acting boss was Little Al Diarco. Now, what Diarco and Baratta did was they were involved in making new members, sitting down for meetings with other families. They were very powerful because they were the people on the street. All other people involved in the panels included Brooklyn's Frank Lastarino, as well as Sal Avellino. One of the things and meetings that Baratta would take as well as Diarca was a meeting with Genovese heavyweight and consigliere James the Little Guy Ida. Now, at one meeting in 1991, Ida would pass around a list to Baratta and Diarco as far as new members that may become made. One of the people that was on the list was this guy, a person called Ralph DeSimone. Now, once Baratta saw Mr. DeSimone's name on the list, he would state to Jimmy Ida that DeSimone was a rat and a confidential informant, to which that was taken from Ida to the hierarchy of the family, which included Michael Mickey Domino Generoso. According to Little Al Diarco, who was present at the meeting, Generoso would tell him, quote, "We'll take care of it," and made the sign of a gun in reference to Mr. DeSimone. Now, I do want to make it abundantly clear. Little Al Diarco is a government informant. Not everything we can take from him is fact. Do I find Little Al Diarco to be somewhat believable in most of the things he talks about? Yes, he is one of the better ones. That said, if there is a better one, that said, do we know that's abundantly true? No, though Generoso did plead to a lot of this stuff. So we can wonder if it's true. The truth of the matter is, though, Ralph DeSimone was found dead months later in June of 1991 in a trunk of a car at LaGuardia Airport. So, they took care of DeSimone. They called him Ralph Cousin DeSimone. So again, Baratta is dealing with family issues. He's dealing with other families' issues. He's in a position of power. The issue, though, was eventually Anthony Casso and his paranoid and lunatic-like ways. Remember, as I said, Baratta was the acting underboss, and the acting boss was Al Diarco. And Diarco talked about the fact that eventually he was just kind of having to deal with all the paranoia and greed that Casso had. Casso from prison was discussing he wanted Diarco to kill an upwards of nearly 50 people, that he had thought had wronged him, or they were, possible power problems, or maybe he thought they were informants. And Diarco kind of stated that Casso wasn't acting rationally, and he didn't do some of the things that he was told to do. One of the things he was told to do by Mr. Casso was take out fat Peter Chiodo, who at one point was very close to Anthony Casso. They did attempt to kill Peter Chiodo because he was indeed an informant, and they shot him 12 times and he survived. That was also problematic due to the fact that Diarco didn't do what he was told, or didn't go the way it was supposed to go. And Diarco kind of saw the writing on the wall. Eventually, as we know, including Baratta, they conspired to kill Al Diarco. And that would take place at a place called the Kimberly Hotel in Midtown Manhattan in 1991, late 1991. This would prompt Mr. Diarco to realize the writing on the wall, and that he was likely a dead man, and he was marked for death by major people in the Lucchese Crime Family. So he flips and cooperates. Now, all of this leads back to the fact that Anthony Casso was a lunatic who was very paranoid that people were doing this and doing that. Remember, it wasn't just one or two people. It was up to 50 people. He wanted to take out the entire Jersey crew. Like, the guy was a complete nut. And the person that fell on his sword was Al Diarco. So once Diarco obviously cooperates, he is no longer the acting boss, and new leadership needs to be figured out. Eventually, Little Joe DeFede takes over at one point, Stephen Crea, Louis Beggles. There was all sorts of people, though Baratta had problems of his own by June of 1992. At that point, Anthony Baratta is indicted for a litany of crimes involving racketeering. They would include attempted murder, extortion, loan sharking, as well as other racketeering predicates. Also indicted was most of his crew, which included his old friends, Curly Russo, Jimmy Cerullo, and Anthony DiMagale. Now, Mr. Baratta pretty much saw the writing on the wall, as he would plead guilty in 1993 to racketeering charges and was given 15 years in federal prison. Now, his initial release date was supposed to be in 2005, though he had all sorts of problems behind the prison wall, which would include a bizarre situation in the late 90s that Mr. Baratta got himself involved in. According to what we know, during his time in prison, you begin meeting people. One of the people he begins meeting is an associate connected to the Lucchese crime family, who basically says to him, look, I have some dope I want to move. Do you know of any buyers? So, like the criminal that Mr. Baratta is, he coordinates a meeting of sorts. He's the middleman. The problem was, it was the DEA, and he gets re-indicted. Now, he was also indicted for his involvement in taking out two garbage haulers from Long Island, Donald Barstow and Robert Kubeca. Though with the case involving the narcotics in prison, he eventually gets 8 years on top of the 15 years. So this was really problematic for Mr. Baratta. Luckily for him, he kept his nose clean for the foreseeable future. Now, before we get to more on Anthony Baratta, and I have to say, there's a pretty funny story that I'm going to get to in prison. I invite everybody listening, watching, if you're checking us out on YouTube currently and you enjoy all the content that I put out here for free, I might add, if you'd like to support our channel further, hit that super thanks icon underneath the video. Any contributions go a long way to the improvement of this channel through equipment, traveling, paying people to do thumbnails and other things like that. So if you enjoy what we're doing, hit that thanks icon underneath the video. Now, during his time in prison, there was a pretty funny exchange that I would find on prison wiretaps and phone calls after a little bit of a quarrel begins between Anthony Bowat Baratta and Stephen Crea. Now, Stephen Crea, high-ranking member of Lucchese Family, at one point was acting boss. From what we would gather, there was a beef between Crea and Baratta over a table at Rayo's. And the one thing I found out about Mr. Baratta, he lived very close to Rayo's. He lived on Pleasant Avenue for years. And he had a regular table. He was regularly at Rayo's. He really enjoyed it. We do know that over the years, many gangsters enjoy going to Rayo's, but a table is very coveted. There's only about a dozen or so tables inside the restaurant. And what we find out is there is a feud that develops, according to the police, through a person called Dom Truscello. Truscello has a phone call with Crea. Now, Truscello is a made member of the family as well. They have a phone call over Crea getting the rights, transferred from Baratta to Baratta's son. At one point, Truscello receives a message, according to him, from his, quote, off-the-wall son and blasted him over the request. Now, in a January 1999 cell phone call, Truscello called Crea mad and told him to come over to his home. Crea would state, quote, "To tell you the truth, I do not even want to acknowledge it from his son. You give him that message. I will not even acknowledge it from his son." Now, eventually, in another conversation, Truscello would state that he met up with the kid again, reporting what Crea said, saying that, quote, "This off-the-wall kid is acting like a fucking little prick and a fucking motherfucker." So I guess the kid was kicking up dust over the table. He wanted his father's table, and the gangsters weren't recognizing that. To which eventually, from what I understand, this got figured out, and they divvied out the table. But tables at Rayo's are a big thing. And look, here's what I would do. I would rent the table out. I'm sure many people do that. But this is problematic. A lot of gangsters over the years like Rayo's, and there was even squabbles over the table between Bowat Baratta as well as Stephen Crea. Now, eventually for Anthony Baratta, he would eventually get out of prison about 7 years late. He was released in September of 2012. Remember, he went in 1992 and he got out in September of 2012. So he basically did about 20 years behind the wall. That is no picnic. And that's definitely a long time inside. And what's interesting is he's kind of reminiscent of Phil Leotardo in The Sopranos. He did 20 fucking years and he gets out and he wants to kind of, I think, assert himself right back into the fold, which we would find out. And I've said this time and time again, people that are born in the 30s, the early 40s, that become members of the mafia in the 60s and 70s, in the 2000s, they don't just get out of prison and go, twiddle their thumbs and watch Price is Right all day. It doesn't work like that. These guys realize at this point. So when you're looking at someone like Baratta, he gets out in 2012. Baratta has enough money. He has probably more money than God. He probably has the first dollar he made. And again, you can still earn. I think the goal, though, is if you're Baratta, you A, want to stay out of prison, and B, you want to stay away from violent crime and selling narcotics, because those are the things that will put you under the jail. And I think Baratta is so insulated. I mean, he's an old man at this point, and the money that he has, I think for him, he's really just about being around the guys. He knows those people. This is all he knows. And I think when we hear about Mr. Baratta being the alleged consigliere of this family right now, and that was reported years ago. It's been alleged that he's been the consigliere for almost 4 years now. There's several reasons that I would venture to believe that is true. Number one, he is old and he is a counselor. He's been around a long time. He's been through all sorts of things. Okay, he did his time. He's respected. He's an elder statesman. He's 86 years old. Number two, the base of power of the Lucchese crime family for a long period of time was in the Bronx with Crea and those guys. It's no longer there. it's back into the control, and it's been under the control of Brooklyn, the original area of where a lot of this family was based. Remember, a lot of the people in the Brooklyn world of the Lucchese family, all of them came up under Paulie Vario many years ago. They then came up under Casso, people like Big Mike DeSantis, Georgie Neck, all those guys. They're now the ones in control of this family. Now, Musso is your official boss behind the wall, just by name only. The people on the streets, though, are in Brooklyn. Now, it wouldn't surprise me. It would be actually quite coincidental and work that there is one person on the committee at the top, the third guy, that is from Harlem. It would make a lot of sense. He's not a Bronx guy. He's very connected, knows a lot of those people. And we would have this confirmed. He is still very involved. This is a photo taken in 2020 at Jefferson Park in East Harlem. Now, I'm going to identify the individuals in this photo. On the far left, in the gray, that is former Lucchese consigliere Andrew DeSimone. In the blue tracksuit, to his right, is the alleged boss of this family, Big Mike DeSantis. The bald guy is Anthony Villani, who was recently, involved with all sorts of stuff. He's a reputed soldier. The individual with the sunglasses on, with the mask, that is alleged to be Georgie Neck Zappola. And anybody that knows anything about the Lucchese crime family, it's been under suspicion that for years, Mike DeSantis is looking to take more of a backseat role and retire. The boss in waiting is said to be George Zappola. George Zappola is another guy who spent a lot of time in prison, did 20 plus years, Brooklyn guy. It's alleged that he is the boss in waiting. Now, the other members in this photo, the person sitting is Frank Salerno, Skinny Frank. The person with his back turned to us is Anthony Bowat Baratta, and that was confirmed by multiple media sources. Okay, so again, this person, the guy with his back turned, you don't just walk up to these people and start talking. It was clear that he was respected. So there's a lot of reason to believe that Bowat Baratta is still involved. He is still connected to these people. It's not like he's playing pinochle and drinking Manhattans at home every day. He is out doing things. He lives in the Bronx. He's 86 years old, and he is towards the end of his life. But remember, this is a person that was born in 1938. This is a person that likely got involved with members of the mafia in the 60s, early 60s. It is 2025. He is one of the old school people, very few left in the world of the American Mafia. He did over 20 years. This right here is a gangster to the core. Do I think he's still involved? Absolutely. And I think we have ready proof that that is indeed true. Anthony Baratta, one of the more interesting people in a wild life, been through the days of some of the early titans of narcotics in New York, right? Grew up in East Harlem, right? Then he becomes a member. He's elevated. He's on the panel. He's a very trusted guy. He goes away and does 20 years, comes out, right back at it. These kind of people don't really exist anymore. And just another story of another gangster that kept the wheel turning in the American Mafia. I've wanted to do a show on Bowat Baratta for a while. By the way, before we end, a lot of people ask, where did he get that nickname from? According to multiple sourcing that I had, it was said that his uncle was called Peter Bowat and his uncle Michael was called Michael Bowat. So where that comes from, I don't know. Maybe an old, Harlem guy would know in the comments. We have all sorts of people around. I have no idea though. But I do have a documentation that several other members of the family were also called Peter Bowat. So I've also heard a name refer to Anthony Baratta as Anthony Beretta. Just could have been a play on the weapon and it sounding similar. I don't know where the Bowat though came from. It is interesting too that in some of the census documentation that I found on Baratta is that over the years, and this is pretty customary in like the 20s and the 30s, the writing and the cursive, it IDs the names differently, right? So at one point you see Beretta with an E. You also see Baratta. You see different phonetic spelling of the name. So at any rate, Bowat, I don't know where it comes from. It could have been something from back in the day. When you look up Bowat, it really is just a name. And it's a Scottish dialect. I don't know. So if anybody knows, or maybe you have another idea, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this episode on Anthony Bowat Baratta. As always, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, support what we're doing, share this with your friends, retweet it on Twitter if you see it. And anybody listening, make sure you keep the word of mouth going. We appreciate it here on the Sit Down. We'll see you next week here on the show.